In the year 1901, a young dentist stepped off a train in a small Colorado town and found something that made no sense. Nearly everyone he examined had hideous teeth stained a mottled, ugly brown, streaked and blotched as though they had been scorched by fire. It looked like a disease, but it was the second half of the mystery that would haunt him for the next 30 years, because those same ruined-looking teeth almost never rotted. In a town of brown, blotched smiles, cavities were strangely, remarkably rare. Something in that place was disfiguring people's teeth and protecting them at the very same time. The answer would turn out to be a substance we would one day deliberately add to the drinking water of hundreds of millions of people. A substance that is also at the wrong dose, a genuine poison. This is the history of fluoride. The dentist's name was Frederick McKay, and when he arrived in Colorado Springs, fresh out of dental school, the brown teeth of the locals baffled him completely. Nothing in his training explained it. The staining was so common that residents barely remarked on it. They simply called it the Colorado brown stain and assumed it was something in the air or the water or just the way things were. But McKay could not let it go. He was looking at a defect that behaved like nothing he had ever read about, and he decided to find out what caused it. It became the work of his life. For years, McKay examined thousands of mouths across the region, mapping exactly which communities had the stain and which did not. He eventually drew in one of the most respected dental researchers in the country, a man named Greene Vardiman Black, and together they studied the mottled enamel in detail. They confirmed the strange thing McKay had suspected from the start. The stained teeth, ugly as they were unusually resistant to decay. Whatever was marking them was also somehow armoring them. But what? McKay ruled out possibility after possibility. It was not diet exactly. It was not poverty or wealth. It was not any germ they could find. The one clue that kept surfacing was the water. The staining seemed to travel with the local water supply, move to a town with different water, and children born afterward would grow up with normal teeth. Whole communities could be marked or spared depending on which spring or well they drank from. Something dissolved in the water was doing this, present in some places and absent in others, invisible, tasteless, and powerful enough to reshape the teeth of everyone who grew up drinking it. McKay even watched it happen in reverse. In one town, after the water source was changed, the brown stain simply stopped appearing in the next generation of children. The cause was in the water. He was certain of it. He just could not name the substance. For nearly 3 decades, the mystery of the Colorado brown stain sat unsolved, a defect that protected, hiding in the drinking water of the American West, waiting for someone to identify it. The answer finally arrived in the early 1930s, and it came, fittingly, from industry. In a town in Arkansas that also had the telltale stained teeth, the water supply happened to be near a large aluminum company, and a chemist working for that company ran a careful analysis of the water. Buried in the results was the culprit that had eluded McKay for 30 years. The water was unusually high in fluoride. Fluoride is a form of the element fluorine. And to understand this story, you have to understand what fluorine actually is, because it is not a gentle thing. Pure fluorine is one of the most violently reactive substances in all of chemistry, so aggressive it can make materials burst into flame on contact. In nature, it never sits still on its own. It is always locked into compounds, and those compounds, fluorides, turn up in rock, in soil, and dissolved in groundwater as it filters through the earth. In some places, entirely by nature, water carries a great deal of it. In others, almost none. And here is the detail that sits at the uneasy center of this whole story. Fluoride compounds were and are genuinely toxic. Certain fluoride salts were used for years as ingredients in rat poison and in insecticides, precisely because they kill living things. Fluoride is also a byproduct of heavy industry, of aluminum smelting and fertilizer manufacturing, an industrial waste product that factories once struggled to dispose of. So the substance McKay had been chasing was not some wholesome mineral tonic. It was a chemical cousin of pesticide and industrial pollution. And it was the thing that had been quietly protecting an entire region's teeth from decay. That was the paradox laid bare. The exact same substance that stained teeth brown and that in other forms poisoned rats and insects was in the water, hardening tooth enamel against decay. The stain and the shield were one and the same, which raised the question that would define everything that came after. And that has never entirely gone away. If a little of this poison protected teeth and a lot of it disfigured them, then how much was the right amount? Where exactly was the line? A public health dentist named Trenley Dean set out to find it. Through the 1930s, Dean studied communities across the United States with different natural levels of fluoride in their water, comparing the rates of tooth decay against the rates of that brown modeling. And a pattern emerged with startling clarity. As fluoride in the water rose, tooth decay fell, but pushed the fluoride too high and the ugly staining set in. Somewhere in between was a narrow window, a level low enough to avoid the worst of the modeling, yet high enough to protect the teeth. Dean's work pointed to a concentration of roughly 1 part per million, about 1 part fluoride to 1 million parts water, as the balance point. Enough to shield the teeth. Not enough, in most people, to ruin them. It was, in a sense, a recipe. And it led directly to one of the boldest, most consequential public health experiments of the 20th century. The idea was audacious. If nature added fluoride to some community's water and gave them stronger teeth, why not add it deliberately and carefully to a community's water at that ideal level and give everyone the benefit on purpose? In the year 1945, the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan, became the first place on Earth to do exactly that, deliberately adding fluoride to its public water supply in a controlled experiment. A nearby city, Muskegon, was watched as a comparison, its water left untouched. Then they waited and they measured, because the real test would be the children, the ones who would grow up drinking the treated water as their teeth formed. The results gathered over the following years were dramatic. Tooth decay among the children of Grand Rapids fell steeply, by figures often cited around 60%, compared with what came before. An entire generation was growing up with markedly fewer cavities, less pain, fewer pulled teeth, fewer nights kept awake by aching mouths. Part of why it worked comes down to what fluoride actually does at the surface of a tooth, and understanding that will matter later. Your tooth enamel is under constant chemical assault. The bacteria in your mouth feed on sugars and produce acid, and that acid slowly dissolves the mineral of the enamel, the beginning of a cavity. Fluoride intervenes in that process. It is drawn into the surface of the enamel, where it helps rebuild the mineral and forms a tougher, more acid-resistant compound, so the tooth can better withstand the daily attack and even repair early damage before a cavity takes hold. For decades, it was assumed that the key was swallowing fluoride while the teeth were still forming. But the scientific understanding gradually shifted. And today, most researchers believe fluoride's benefit is mainly topical, acting on the surface of teeth that are already in the mouth from direct contact rather than from being ingested. Hold on to that point, because it becomes one of the sharpest edges of the modern argument. It also explains why fluoride did not stay in the water. From the middle of the 20th century, fluoride was added to toothpaste, brushed directly onto the teeth twice a day by hundreds of millions of people. And around the year 1960, the American Dental Association formally recognized a fluoride toothpaste as effective against decay. That, more than anything, put fluoride into nearly every bathroom on Earth. So the substance existed now in two forms at once: the fluoride you chose to put on your teeth, from a tube with your name on the toothbrush, and the fluoride added to the water of your whole city, whether you chose it or not. That difference, chosen versus given, is the quiet fault line the rest of this story runs along. It is important to be fair to what this was, because it was, by most measures, a genuine triumph. Tooth decay is not a trivial thing. Before modern dentistry, rotten teeth meant chronic pain, dangerous infections that could spread and even kill, and the slow loss of the ability to eat properly. For most of human history, bad teeth were simply part of the human condition. And here was a cheap, simple intervention that appeared to spare enormous numbers of people, especially poor children with little access to dentists, from a lifetime of that suffering. Water fluoridation spread rapidly across the United States and to other countries. Decades later, health authorities would call it one of the great public health achievements of the century, and mainstream bodies estimated it reduced tooth decay in whole populations by something like a quarter, with other estimates ranging higher. For a great many people, the benefit was and is entirely real. But look closely at what had just happened, because folded inside that triumph was the seed of every argument that would follow. This was not medicine you chose to take. It was not a pill you could accept or decline, or a treatment your dentist offered you. It was added to the water of an entire population, delivered to everyone who turned on a tap, whether they knew about it or not, whether they wanted it or not, whether they were an adult or an infant, healthy or sick. It was, in effect, a medication given to a whole society at once, without asking each person individually. To its supporters, that was precisely the genius of it. That was why it worked so well and reached the people who needed it most, the ones who would never see a dentist, the children of families with nothing. You did not have to convince anyone or sell anything or rely on people to follow instructions. You simply treated the water, and the whole community benefited. It was public health at its most efficient. But to others, that same feature was the problem, and it is worth stating their objection plainly and fairly, because it is not a foolish one. A person can refuse almost any other medical treatment. You can decline a drug, skip a vaccine, walk out of a doctor's office. But you cannot easily decline the water. Water is not optional. And so fluoridation became the one substance that a government could, in effect, ask an entire population to consume, with no realistic way for an individual to opt out short of buying all their water elsewhere. Whatever you think of fluoride itself, that question, the question of consent, of whether it is right to add anything to everyone's water, regardless of individual choice, is a real one. And it would sit underneath the fluoride debate for the next 80 years, waiting, no matter what the science said. Because the science on one crucial point was never really in dispute. Fluoride at a high enough dose genuinely harms people. The entire safety of water fluoridation rested and rests on a single word: dose. Start with the mildest harm, the one McKay had been staring at from the very beginning. That brown mottling of the teeth has a name: dental fluorosis. It is, quite simply, what too much fluoride does to developing teeth, and in its worst forms it can pit and discolor the enamel permanently. The Colorado brown stain was fluorosis all along, the visible signature of natural water that carried more fluoride than the ideal, but climb the dose higher, to the levels found naturally in some parts of the world. And the harm goes far deeper than the teeth. In regions of India, of China, and elsewhere, where groundwater is naturally very high in fluoride, people can develop a condition called skeletal fluorosis. Over years of drinking that water, fluoride accumulates in the bones, and the skeleton itself begins to change, thickening, hardening, and calcifying in the wrong places. Joints stiffen and ache, ligaments turn to bone. In severe long-term cases, the spine can fuse and the body can bend and lock into crippling deformity. This is not a rare theoretical risk. It is an endemic disease, and by some estimates, tens of millions of people across those regions live with health effects from naturally fluoride-heavy water. It is a genuine mass poisoning, written into the bones of the people it strikes, caused by nothing more exotic than the water beneath their feet. And at the extreme, in large enough amounts swallowed at once, fluoride is acutely toxic, capable of causing serious illness and, in rare cases, death. Which is exactly why fluoride-containing products carry warnings, and why history includes industrial accidents and exposures where concentrated fluoride harmed the workers who handled it. None of this is fringe or disputed. Fluoride at high enough doses is dangerous. Everyone on every side of this argument agrees on that. The entire question of fluoridation has always been whether the tiny controlled dose added to public water is safely far below the levels that cause this harm, or whether it is closer to the line than we would like to believe. There is an industrial shadow here too, one that gave fluoride's critics some of their deepest suspicion. Long before it was in the water, fluoride was one of the most damaging air pollutants of heavy industry. Aluminum smelters and phosphate fertilizer plants released fluoride into the air, and it settled on the surrounding countryside, where it scorched crops and, notoriously, poisoned livestock. Cattle grazing near certain factories developed their own skeletal fluorosis, their bones and teeth deforming, their bodies wasting, and the resulting damage led to significant lawsuits over the middle of the 20th century. There is also a wartime thread that skeptics point to. Fluoride compounds were important to the secret work of the atomic bomb program, and some of the early toxicology research on fluoride was tied to that industrial and military world. Supporters say that history is beside the point, that a poison's origins do not determine whether a controlled dose is safe. Critics say a substance that was an industrial waste product and a documented polluter deserved more suspicion than it got when it was proposed for the public's water. Both in their way are describing the same uncomfortable fact. The thing protecting the nation's teeth had a genuinely dark industrial resume. That genuine dose-dependent toxicity is the soil in which something much stranger grew. Because in the middle of the 20th century, fluoridation did not just spark a scientific debate, it ignited one of the most feverish conspiracy panics of the era. As town after town moved to fluoridate its water in the 1950s, a wave of intense opposition rose to meet it, and some of it went to genuinely wild places. In the tense, paranoid atmosphere of the early Cold War, fluoridation of the water supply became, for some, proof of a sinister plot. It was cast as a communist scheme to weaken the American population, to poison the nation quietly from within, or even to control people's minds through the water. Political groups of the era warned darkly that fluoridation was a step toward tyranny. The panic became so famous that it was immortalized on film. In the 1964 movie Dr. Strangelove, a deranged general launches a nuclear attack because he is convinced that fluoridation is a communist conspiracy to contaminate, in his words, the purity of Americans' precious bodily fluids. To audiences at the time, the joke landed instantly, because everyone recognized the real panic it was mocking. It would be easy from here to simply laugh at all of that, and much of it does deserve to be set aside as the false and often paranoid theorizing it was. There was no communist plot, there was no mind control in the water, but it is worth resisting the urge to sneer. Because underneath the wildest theories sat a real and reasonable unease that was not crazy at all. People were being asked to let their government add a chemical, one they knew was toxic in other contexts and derived partly from industrial waste, to the water of their children without asking them first. The specific theories were wrong, often absurdly so, but the underlying discomfort, the feeling of being medicated without consent, of being asked to simply trust the authorities, was rooted in something real. And separating the genuine concern from the conspiracy became harder, not easier, as the decades passed, because the science itself never fully stopped moving. Which brings us to the present, and to the reason this story does not end with a tidy verdict, the way the others do. Because the argument over fluoride is not history, it is happening right now. In recent years, a body of research has been building that looks not at teeth or bones, but at the developing brains of children, and specifically at fluoride exposure during pregnancy and early childhood. In August of the year 2024, the National Toxicology Program, a respected United States government research body, published a major review of this evidence. Its central conclusion has to be stated with great care because the exact wording matters enormously, and it is easy to distort in either direction. The review concluded with what it called moderate confidence that higher levels of fluoride exposure are associated with lower measures of intelligence, lower I. Q scores in children. Now, read the fine print, because the fine print is the entire story. The review defined that higher exposure as levels above 1.5 milligrams of fluoride per liter of water. That is more than double the level, roughly 0.7 of a milligram per liter, that is actually used to fluoridate drinking water in the United States. The report explicitly stated that there was not enough data to determine whether that lower, standard fluoridation level has any effect on children's intelligence at all. It did not assess the benefits of fluoride for teeth. It found no evidence of harm to adult thinking. And the studies it leaned on were largely conducted in other countries, often in places with far higher natural fluoride than a typical American tap. A related analysis published the following year again reported an association between higher fluoride and lower childhood IQ. Yet even its own authors did not call for fluoride to be removed from drinking water. So what does that actually tell us? Honestly, and this is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the modern debate, it tells us that the question is genuinely unresolved. Researchers do not agree on what it means for the low levels used in public water. Some scientists look at this evidence and see a real warning, especially for pregnant women and infants, and argue for caution. Others point out that the clear effects appear only at higher exposures than fluoridated water provides, that association is not the same as proof of cause, and that the decades of benefit to teeth are well established, while the harm at low doses remains uncertain. Both of those positions are held by serious people looking at the same studies. Anyone who tells you this is simple in either direction is selling you something. Where that uncertainty lands most heavily is on the very young. Most of the concern in the recent research centers not on adults, but on exposure during pregnancy and the first months and years of life, when the brain is developing fastest. That is why some researchers have suggested caution specifically for pregnant women and for infants, and why one commonly raised point involves babies fed on formula. If the powder is mixed with fluoridated tap water, feed after feed, a bottle-fed infant can take in proportionally more fluoride than almost anyone else, relative to their tiny body weight. Supporters respond that the levels involved remain low, that the evidence of actual harm at those levels is far from settled, and that the benefits to a lifetime of teeth are real and proven. It is, once again, an unresolved balance, argued over the smallest and most vulnerable people in the story. And that scientific uncertainty has now collided head-on with law and politics. In September of the year 2024, a federal judge ruled in a long-running lawsuit that fluoride in drinking water, at the levels typically used in the United States, posed what the law calls an unreasonable risk to the health of children, and ordered the Environmental Protection Agency to take regulatory action. But even that judge was careful, noting explicitly that his finding did not conclude with certainty that fluoridated water is actually injurious to public health, only that the risk was serious enough to require a response. And the story did not end there. That landmark ruling was later challenged and, on appeal, overturned, with a higher court finding that the trial judge had overstepped his role, siding with the agency on process and leaving the underlying question as unsettled as ever. Meanwhile, the ground has been shifting town by town and state by state. In the year 2025, Utah became the first state in the country to ban the addition of fluoride to its public water systems, followed soon after by Florida. And notably, the argument that carried Utah's ban was not primarily that fluoride was proven dangerous. The bill's own sponsor acknowledged that fluoride had benefits. Her central argument was about consent, the same objection that had haunted fluoridation from the very first day in Grand Rapids. That a government should not medicate an entire population through the water without each person's informed choice. At the national level, senior health officials began calling for the practice to be reconsidered, and dozens of communities serving millions of people moved to end or suspend fluoridation. And on the other side, major medical and dental organizations continued to defend it firmly, warning that abandoning fluoride would bring a wave of cavities and suffering that would fall hardest, once again, on the poorest children. There is one more fact that refuses to let either side win cleanly, and it is worth sitting with. Much of the wealthy world never fluoridated its water at all. Most of continental Western Europe, countries like Germany, France, the Netherlands, and Sweden, does not add fluoride to public drinking water, and in many cases stopped or rejected it decades ago, often on exactly the grounds of consent and individual choice. And yet, tooth decay fell dramatically across those countries over the same period that it fell in the fluoridating world. To supporters of fluoridation, that is not a contradiction at all. They point out that fluoride toothpaste became universal everywhere, that Europeans get their fluoride topically and through other channels, and that water fluoridation still adds a real benefit, especially for the poor who brush less and see dentists least. To critics, that same fact is close to a smoking gun. If nations without fluoridated water achieved similar improvements in dental health, then perhaps swallowing fluoride in the water was never the essential ingredient. And the topical fluoride on a toothbrush was doing most of the work all along. Once again, the very same evidence is read by serious people as pointing in opposite directions. So there is no ending to give you. There is only the argument still burning more than a century after Frederick McKay first puzzled over those brown teeth in Colorado. And that is what makes fluoride different from every other poison in this story. The arsenic in the wallpaper, the lead in the pipes, the radium on the watch dials, the mercury in the hats. All of those were tragedies of ignorance or denial, poisons we were fooled by or warned about and used anyway, and eventually, painfully, learned to fear. Fluoride is not like that. Fluoride is the poison we understood and measured and calculated a dose for, and then chose to add to our own water with open eyes on purpose, because we judged that the good it did was worth the risk it carried. And we are still right now arguing about whether we did the arithmetic correctly. The benefit to millions of teeth and the uncertainty about developing brains sit together on the same scale, and the scale has not stopped moving. It was never really a story about a chemical. Fluoride never changed. It hardens enamel, and it poisons rats, and it stains teeth, and it accumulates in bone. And it does every one of those things at once exactly as it always has. The only thing that ever separated the medicine from the poison, the shield from the stain, the cure from the crippling, was a number. How much? That was the whole story. It always was. The difference between the two was only ever the dose. If this changed the way you think about the water in your glass, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you think the line should be drawn. And share this with someone who has never once wondered what is really dissolved in their tap water and whether anyone ever asked them.